Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Baker. I'm with Frontier Precision, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on UAS and the Surveyor. And this session is being recorded so that we can put it up on our blog site in the next couple of days, and so that if you wanted to view it again or someone else within your organization wanted to view it, they can go to our blog site and take a look at it. I have everybody muted, so you can hear me, but I cannot hear you. And when we have this many attendees, that usually works out the best. However, if you do have a question, please put it in your question box on your webinar control panel, and we'll try to answer as many of the questions as we can. If we can't get to all of them, or there's some that we don't have the answer to, then we will respond via email, and possibly if there's a lot of them that we can't answer, we'll put together an FAQ that will correspond with this recording of this webinar, and we'll post that along with the webinar. So let's go ahead and get started. I'd like again to thank you all for attending today. We have a pretty good turnout on today's webinar. So the title of this is The Status of Unmanned Aerial Systems for Surveyors. Again, my name is Brian Baker. I'm the Special Projects Manager for Frontier Precision, as well as a Certified Trimble Trainer. So we'll get right into it. So the agenda for this morning's presentation is a little bit of definition. What is a UAS? What's the difference between a UAS and a radio control system? Who can legally acquire and operate a UAS? What is the big deal with the UAS and the U.S. airspace? What you'll need for UAS commercial operations once the FAA has integrated UAS into the National Airspace System, and what you can do now to start getting ready for it. This presentation is based off of an article in this month's Professional Surveyor magazine, and it goes into a little bit more detail than this webinar is going to go into. So you can also use this as a reference to answer a lot of questions that you have regarding UAS. There's some other information contained in the article. There's going to be a few different examples in this webinar that aren't in the article. One of the things about UAS is that it is rapidly changing. Not so much on the FAA side of things, but on the technology side of things, there's a lot of things happening very quickly. So we'll talk about some of those and give you a little bit of an update since this article was actually written, even though it's in this month's issue of Professional Surveyor. I wrote it back in March. We're going to be talking a little bit about the Federal Aviation Administration because they are integral to our ability to operate unmanned aircraft systems. And as a pilot, there's kind of an unofficial motto that the FAA has, and that is that we're not happy until you're not happy. And if you've had any experience with the FAA, I wouldn't probably limit this to one federal agency, but you can know that some of their regulations and some of their requirements can be a little onerous at times. And there are a lot of great people that work at the FAA. I know several of them, and they try to do a really good job. Sometimes the bureaucracy gets in the way, as is the case right now with UAS. So we'll talk a little bit about that. First off, I want to talk about what is an unmanned aircraft system, an unmanned aerial system. And this comes from the FAA's documentation, that it's all of the associated support equipment, control station, data links, telemetry, communications, navigation equipment, everything necessary to operate the unmanned aircraft. The UA is the flying portion of the system flown by a pilot via a ground control station or autonomously through an onboard computer, communication links, and any additional equipment that's necessary to operate. So this is what the FAA defines a UAS system for. It also says that the FAA issues an experimental airworthiness certificate for the entire system, not just the aircraft itself. So that means in the case of the UX5, the launcher, the tablet PC, the data links, all of those things are part of the system, and therefore they are part of the experimental airworthiness certificate for the UX5. And this is to ensure the entire system maintains the robust standards necessary for safety and airworthiness compliance when you're talking about an aircraft. So if that's the definition of an unmanned aircraft system that the FAA gave us, then what's the difference between the system on the left, which is a typical radio-controlled aircraft, and the system on the right, which is the UX5? When I gave this presentation previously, most people would assume that the difference is the fact that the system on the left is flown by hand by a pilot with a radio control console that's actually controlling the altitude, pitch, bank, and actually flying the aircraft. Whereas the system on the right, the UX5, is pre-programmed. You launch it, and then it flies a programmed path and then returns and lands, where you are not actually manually flying that system. That, however, is not correct. The only difference between these two systems is how they're used. The system on the left is simply a hobby aircraft and has no special airworthiness associated with it. Built probably by the operator of that aircraft and does not adhere to any FAA regulations or certification standards for airworthiness or for usability. The UX5 has a special airworthiness certificate issued by the FAA, and that ensures that this particular aircraft is up to the FAA's requirements for airworthiness and certification for all aircraft, not just unmanned aircraft. Model aircraft are somewhat regulated based on the FAA Advisory Circular in 1981. And basically it said that you need to avoid the proximity of and give right of way to manned aircraft, stay below 400 feet. AGL stands for above ground level, away from populated areas, and not within 3 miles of an airport without approval. And then their clarification in 2007 says that it only applies to modelers and specifically excludes individuals or companies from flying model aircraft for business purposes. So these regulations or these guidelines here that the FAA has regarding model aircraft are what a number of people in the industry are using as guidelines for operating a commercial aircraft system, commercial unmanned system. And it specifically says, based on the policy clarification, that it does not apply to individual companies flying for business purposes. And an aircraft cannot be considered a model or hobby aircraft if they are produced for commercial applications, which the UX5 is, and many other systems out there, including most of the major manufacturers. In fact, if it is being manufactured and is being marketed by a geospatial company, it cannot be considered a model or hobby aircraft because it's being produced for commercial applications. However, some of those same people that are producing it for commercial applications are also indicating that that aircraft can be used under these conditions, and that is not the case in the eyes of the FAA. So here's some sample UAS platforms, both fixed wing and rotorcraft. So these are designed and manufactured for commercial applications by Trimble, Topcon, Leica, um, and like I said, any other geospatial company that's producing one of these systems for an application that any of you that are on this webinar are anticipating using it for is going to be a commercial UAS system. Um, any model or hobby aircraft that has commercial application capability. So another thing that I've heard out in the industry is that, well, I can go and buy one of these hobby aircraft like a Parrot AR down here, and I can stick a GoPro camera on it, and I can go out and take aerial images, and I'm in compliant with the home hobbyist because it's a model aircraft. Well, again, in the eyes of the FAA, that's been converted to commercial applications. It deals with your business and therefore falls under FAA regulations. So as an example, this is an FAA registry for a Trimble UX5 aircraft. So it is registered. It has an N number. So right up here at the top, you'll see N501UX is assigned to this UX5 aircraft. It is registered just like any other aircraft, whether it's a Cessna 172 or a Learjet or a Boeing 737. This is, in the eyes of the FAA, it is a aircraft and is registered as such. Now, it has a special airworthiness certificate for it of an experimental class, which is a little bit different than a Cessna 172 that has a type certificate for it, and because it's produced on a more mass-produced basis. But at some point, I expect that UAS systems will also have their own classification of airworthiness certificates also. That's one of the things that the FAA is trying to get implemented as part of their integration. So then the question is, who can currently operate an unmanned aircraft system? And it's pretty straightforward. A public entity that can obtain a certificate of authorization, this COA as we call it, is issued by the FAA. It is agency specific, is geographically specific, and it's aircraft specific. So that a public entity such as the Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management, City County of Denver, um, St. Louis County in Minnesota, any public entity, this includes public universities, that can obtain a COA can get authorization. So this is basically saying that a public entity is taking all of the liability associated with operating one of these vehicles under their domain. It is and a private individual can't do that. And to do that, it also has to be a public aircraft. So when a UX5 or any other aircraft is purchased by a public entity, it becomes a public aircraft, and therefore it is available to receive a certificate of authorization. In the private sector, the only way to operate under FAA regulations with a UAS is to obtain an experimental airworthiness certificate. And that is generally right now only the domain of manufacturers of the systems, and they can get it for research and testing purposes. So that excludes a lot of people in the private sector, including us as a dealer, Frontier Precision, but certainly uh, land survey customers, private companies are not eligible to operate a UAS under FAA regulations at this time. So this is what all of the big clamor is in the not just the geospatial community, but the unmanned aircraft system community at large, is the lack of ability for a private entity to obtain authorization. So because of that lack of ability, then some people are reverting to the model aircraft approach to it. And as you'll see, that doesn't really work in a lot of cases. So we have a real simple test for whether or not you can operate an unmanned aircraft system. And this is as a public geospatial professional. So BLM, cities, counties, universities, that nature. Are you a public geospatial professional? Yes. Using a public aircraft to collect geospatial data. Able to get a certificate of authorization. If you cannot get a certificate of authorization from the FAA, then you cannot operate one of these systems. Now, why would a public entity not be able to get a certificate of authorization? It may be because, as I mentioned earlier, a COA is geographically based. You have to tell the FAA where you're going to operate this vehicle. And if you're going to operate this vehicle in a congested airspace or a heavily populated area, you probably cannot get a COA. If you're going to operate the aircraft in a remote location, possibly like a landfill um, or some other remote part of a county or of a state or something like that, then you probably can get a COA. So in this particular scenario, this would not be a legal operation. And I use the term illegal in the same sense that the FAA is a regulatory body like the EPA and has the force of law behind their regulations. So while there's not a statute on the U.S. Justice Code regarding UAS operation, it's regulated by the FAA, and so they would consider this type of operation outside of their regulations or unregulated, and it's just easier to call it illegal in my mind. It's like the difference between um, I don't know. There's several examples I could use. If you're able to get a COA, though, you're a public agency, then that is a legal operation, and you could operate a UX5. An example of this would be here in Colorado, Mesa County over on the western slope. They have a UX5 that they're using in some of the unpopulated parts of their county for landfill um, landfill monitoring and volumes, quantity, that sort of thing. So then we move on to the private geospatial professional. So it's a little more, little less options there. So basically, we are shut out of the game at the present time. And again, this is what is creating a lot of the consternation within the UAS community. So we're just not able to operate an unmanned aircraft system because we're not a public entity, so we cannot get a certificate of authorization, and we're not a manufacturer of the system, so we cannot get a special airworthiness certificate from the FAA. So we're hoping that these regulations become, or the FAA releases regulations specifically for smaller aircraft like the UX5 and in less populated airspace areas. Here's an example of what the FAA would consider a unregulated or illegal UAS operation. This is a picture of a landslide that's happening up in Jackson, Wyoming, taken from an unmanned aircraft system who actually copyrighted the image with their company name in the upper right-hand corner. So that's handy for the FAA. And as you can see, this aircraft, while it's not more, in my opinion, not more than 400 feet above the ground, it is operating over a highway or in very close proximity to a highway. And there's even a school bus on the highway. So I know all of you as geospatial professionals and certainly the land surveyors among you are familiar with liability. And if you think that you have liability associated with the land survey, just wait until you launch an aircraft into the sky and see what kind of liability you're going to take on in that scenario. So, um, yeah, there's a lot of things that a number of people aren't thinking about when it comes to UAS, that they can just launch it and it'll come back and everything is going to be fine. But when you talk about aircraft systems, you have to talk about safety always. The FAA regulations that are the federal aviation regulations that they produce, it's a volume about as thick as the Denver Yellow Pages of regulations. And uh, without for probably very few exceptions, they are all relegated to the safety of not just the people that are operating and in proximity of the aircraft, but also people on the ground. So if you are caught by the FAA doing one of these unregulated type of UAS operations, generally the first thing that happens is you get an email from them indicating that you could be considered, I'm sure, let's see, where did they say? Um, let's see. Anyway, it says somewhere here that they could be operating illegally with their unmanned aircraft system. And this particular email shows the kind of the event that was happening, where it was happening. And then right here it says, at this time, there's no allowance for commercial or business UAS operations in the NAS, which stands for the National Airspace System, which is all of the airspace that is over our head. And then it refers this particular individual to the information that the FAA has on this matter. And so this is the first step that the FAA takes when they suspect that somebody is operating an unmanned aircraft system without authorization. The second step, if that operation continues, can be a little more severe, resulting in penalties or fines. It's going to depend on the situation, where the aircraft is being flown, as to how aggressive the FAA wants to be about trying to enforce their regulations. So, what's the big deal with our national airspace system? Our national airspace system is the most complex airspace system in the world. We have a very broad mix of public, private, commercial aircraft that are all trying to share the same airspace. And when the FAA was established, it was mandated with creating the National Airspace System to protect persons and property on the ground. This is a direct quote from their mandate. Protect persons and property on the ground, number one, and to establish a safe and efficient airspace environment for civil, commercial, and military aviation. And it's made up of a network of air navigation facilities, air traffic control facilities, airports, technologies, and appropriate rules and regulations that are needed to operate in this system. So this is a summary of what our national airspace system is about. And we have different classes of airspace. And there are different requirements for operating in that airspace. Class A is above 18,000 feet mean sea level. So this is called Class A airspace, and it requires air traffic control clearance to enter it. You have to have an instrument rating as a pilot, two-way radio communication, several other criteria. And then we drop down into Class B airspace, which is airspace surrounding major metropolitan airports. And you can see this upside down wedding cake type of shape to it because the aircraft are coming in at angles from this Class A airspace, so they're dropping down into the B airspace, and so the airspace is wider at higher altitudes and narrower at the lower altitudes. And then we have Class C airspace. Oh, by the way, Denver and Minneapolis airports are Class B. The only Class C airport within our geographic footprint is Colorado Springs, so it's a little bit busier airport. Class D is an airport just up the road from us at the Metropolitan Airport. And then we have airports that are non-towered airports that are Class E airports, like the airport that I fly out of in Fort Collins. And then the airspace that is above all of these airports is Class E airspace. Outside of all of these airports, you get into some areas where you have Class G airspace. There is no Class F airspace, by the way, in the U.S., so just in case you need a trivia question at parties. So it talks about what's required in each of these airspaces. So let's take a look at an aeronautical chart. This is the aeronautical chart, the VFR sectional chart over Denver. VFR stands for Visual Flight Rules, and so this is the chart that we use for navigating visually. And you can see right here, I've captured right here in the center, this is Denver International Airport. And then you see these concentric rings. These concentric rings correspond to those layers on that upside down wedding cake. So this is the center ring, and it goes from the surface to 12,000 feet. And then this outer layer here goes from 8,000 feet to 12,000 feet. And this layer here goes from 10,000 feet to 12,000 feet. So within this layer, no aircraft can operate from the surface up to 12,000 feet without being in contact with Denver DIA air traffic control. Out here, you can operate an aircraft if you're below 8,000 feet. That doesn't mean an unmanned system. It just means a pilot on a regular aircraft. So I can fly around here below 8,000 feet and not have to talk up to Denver air traffic control. Going into or above 8,000 feet to 12,000 feet, violating DIA's airspace will probably at minimum would result in a suspension of my pilot's license. So they take it very seriously. And then there's this magenta ring out at 30 nautical miles from the center of DIA that all aircraft that enter this ring, regardless of their altitude, have to have a transponder on their aircraft, so that while you may not be talking to air traffic control in Denver, air traffic control can see you on their radar. So there's other things on this aeronautical chart that we won't go into, but you can see right here, this is the Fort Collins Airport. It has a dashed magenta ring around it indicating that it's Class D airspace, or excuse me, Class E airspace, and this magenta area all around this whole part of the front range is Class E airspace. Right down here is, or right here actually, is Rocky Mountain Airport over by Trimble's office. Here's an example of the Minneapolis airspace. You notice it's a different color because it's lower elevation. So elevation is dictated by color on aeronautical charts. So we have the same types of blue lines indicating the airspace. So from the surface to 10,000 feet, here is the center right here at Minneapolis St. Paul Airport, and then goes out to concentric rings. This is all Class E airspace. Here, some more Class B airspace out here, and then the magenta ring for the transponder requirement within 30 nautical miles. What's different about this aeronautical chart is these red circles in the center of it. And these indicate temporary flight restrictions, what are known as TFRs to pilots. That means that you are not allowed to fly in this space at any time without pre-approval from air traffic control. So commercial airliners, they have pre-approval on their regularly scheduled flights. And these temporary flight restrictions can be generated for a number of reasons. In this particular case, it was because the vice president was visiting the Minneapolis-St. Paul area back in February. Um, the president's TFR extends 30 nautical miles from the center of where he is at all times. So 2 weeks ago, he was out in Southern California. 9 pilots violated the TFR. They flew into the restricted flight area. And so those are going to be, there'd be 9 fewer pilots for a while. One of them for a lot longer time, because after he was intercepted and forced to land, he was found to have about 20 pounds of marijuana that he was transporting. So it was just a really bad day for him. He picked the wrong day to go flying. So we have to abide by temporary flight restrictions. You'll see a temporary flight restriction pop up anytime there's a major sporting events, like a Vikings or Broncos game, a Rockies game, or Twins game. There'll be a temporary flight restriction, and that's a 3 nautical mile radius that you can't enter. So these are things that pilots have to be aware of, and that unfortunately a lot of unmanned aircraft system operators are not aware of. That's where you're flying it. So when we're talking about flying, we have critical phases of flight with regard to regular manned aircraft. And that's, of course, on the takeoff and climb out. You're at maximum power, maximum rate of climb. You're also at low altitude because you're starting from the ground. And then approach and landing, you're at minimum power and slow speed. And you're also at low altitude because you're trying to get back on the ground. In both of these instances, the aircraft is operating in the UAS type of environment. So this is where an unmanned aircraft system is going to typically be operating at these lower altitudes, whether it's 400 feet, 500 feet, 1,000 feet, even 2,000 feet. These are at altitudes where commercial and private aircraft operate. Generally, they're only operating in these situations near an airport, because you don't really want to land somewhere other than an airport, and you're generally always taking off from an airport. So in proximity of an airport is obviously a concern. But there's situations where you may not realize you're in the proximity of an airport. And take a look at one of those. So I'm going to pause the presentation here for a second and bring this example up. This is just up the road from our office here in Denver. It's I-25. It's up in the Loveland area, for those of you familiar with the area. This area is under continuous commercial development. As you can see, the north side of Highway 34 has been fairly extensively developed. The south side, not so much yet. I guess the farmer here is waiting for the right price on his land. So I put together a simulated flight path of a UX-5 that might be of interest to a private land surveyor development company that wanted to go out and get some aerial images of this particular property. And as you can see, we rotate it around here. The flight path is about 1,000 feet above the ground. So there's an example of what that flight path would look like. One thing that you'll notice right here is the Fort Collins Airport and the runway 33 extending off in direction of 333 degrees. So if we zoom in on that, we can see the arrival end of runway 33. So I zoom back here, and so the aircraft hang out around here in this area. Private aircraft are going to come in and land generally in an L-shaped type of pattern. So they're not really hanging out over here. But one thing that you would not see is right here, there's a hospital. And at this hospital, there is a helipad here and a helipad here with actually a helicopter on it. And that is within just less than half a mile of this particular area. Now, one thing that sometimes pilots do when they're coming into an airport like Fort Collins Airport is they'll use what's called an instrument approach. And an instrument approach procedure allows the pilot to very easily navigate into an airport without being able to see the airport until the last minute. And so if a pilot's unfamiliar with an area, or if it's a commercial flight, or even a private general aviation flight of something like a larger aircraft that flies in Class A airspace up above 18,000 feet, a lot of times they'll use instrument approaches. And that instrument approach is a prescribed procedure for landing. And if we look at an instrument approach for the Fort Collins Airport, you'll see that the glide path will take that airplane right through that proposed flight area. This is a waypoint called Collin, and then this is the glide slope that takes an aircraft down. And autopilots are programmed with this approach procedure in them. And even some very small aircraft, you can call up the approach procedure for this airport, and the autopilot will fly it down and to a minimum altitude or decision height, at which point the pilot can take over and physically land the aircraft. So the glide slope here is cutting right through this area, and it would be very easy to think that you're plenty far away from the airport, but then you can have a Learjet come whizzing through here and not even see that you're operating. So that's a safety issue. It's one of the issues that the FAA is struggling with, but it's an example of what can happen. So let's go back to slideshow. So that's one safety issue. So let's talk a little bit about what's in the news, and I'm going to run, hopefully this audio will come through on this. And Jay, if you'll tell me if there's a problem with this when the audio starts, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, Brian, I don't think we're getting any audio through.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Okay. So Jay tells me that the audio is not coming through. That's fine. It's just a news report of an unmanned aircraft system that crashed into the tallest building in St. Louis, and the FAA and the FBI are searching for the owner of that aircraft. And it goes on in the video to show another example of video taken from above the arch. The arch is 600 and something feet. It was taken from above it, well above 400 feet that some people are saying they can operate legally under. And also the arch is in the Class Delta airspace of the St. Louis downtown airport, which means any air operations from the surface to whatever their ceiling is there has to report to air traffic control. So, and then just in the last week, this popped up. It was just a matter of time. that we had a near miss. This was in Tallahassee with a Delta jet that was landing. The pilot actually thought that he had hit the unmanned aircraft system. And it wasn't until he got on the ground and inspected the plane that he realized that he hadn't. And at the time the incident occurred, the commercial jetliner was at about 2,500 feet above the ground. So he wasn't doing a low pass. He was on a long approach into Tallahassee, but you still have to come down at a certain rate. Otherwise, passengers get really upset if you try to go down too fast. So anyway, it was a matter of time before that happened, and it has, and the FAA is investigating that. So unfortunately, I think it's also a matter of time before a near miss turns into an actual strike. And it's going to be in one of these critical phases of flight that aircraft operate in, and it's going to be bad news. So, what will these regulations look like when the FAA finally comes out with them? Um, well, they're most likely going to be based on the size, weight, range, and possibly the flight control system of the unmanned aircraft system. Smaller aircraft that are more automated may have fewer regulations. It's also probably going to be based on where the aircraft, the unmanned system, is flown. In Class G airspace, there'll probably be fewer regulations. So places for agricultural operations, mining operations, um, public sector, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, uh, places like that are airspace that's uncongested. It's going to be much easier to operate an aircraft system in that environment. You get into Class B airspace, and you're going to have maximum regulation, and it's probably not going to be limited or based on size. In fact, there'll probably be more regulations just for the fact that it's in the Class B airspace, meaning that somebody wants to fly a drone over downtown St. Louis or downtown Minneapolis. There's been several instances, one in particular of an unmanned aircraft system that hit a building and dropped onto the sidewalk in Manhattan. Um, so there's going to be more regulations involving that. You've got a lot more things to worry about in those environments. You've got obstructions like tall buildings, people on the ground, just a very congested environment. So expect maximum regulation in Class B airspace, and fewer regulation in Class G airspace. Well, mostly geospatial professionals are mapping things where people are. And so that's going to present a challenge for land surveying companies, the private companies, because they're going to want aerial imagery in places that are probably more populated and more congested. So I would expect as a geospatial professional that if you want to operate an unmanned aircraft system, that you may need to prepare yourself a little bit better than somebody who is operating one over a coal mine in western Colorado. It may also be based on the training program of the UAS. Um, so there are going to be some systems where people just hand them to you and say, have a nice day, good luck with that. And then there's going to be other systems like the Trimble system where training is mandatory, and there will be certain flight standards that will be necessary to be maintained to ensure safety of the operation of the aircraft. So what will you need once the UAS regulations are in place? Well, it's going to, again, depend on the type of system that you're operating and where you're operating it. But potentially, you could have to go through an FAA-approved ground school curriculum, much like a private pilot does, but with probably a little less content. So in Class B airspace, since you have to talk to air traffic control, you would have to know how the ATC control system works. So that may be part of a ground school curriculum if you're going to be operating in that type of environment. You need to know about instrument approach procedures. You need to know about the different classes of airspace. So there may be some sort of ground school curriculum. Again, if you are operating at a fixed location, such as a mine or BLM land or something like that, maybe just having demonstrated proficiency with your system would be good enough. You may have to pass a FAA written exam that covers this curriculum. You may have to have a practical training on the specific UAS system. And by practical training, I mean someone training you on the launch, in-flight, recovery procedures, emergency procedures. So actually training you on those procedures, not just giving you a manual and saying, yeah, here you go, charge up the batteries and you're good to go. And at probably the outside extreme, you may have to actually have a practical examination by an FAA examiner on your particular UAS system. If it's a big enough system in congested enough airspace, you can pretty much guarantee that you're going to have to be probably nothing short of a actual pilot. You'll have to maintain pilot, aircraft, engine, and propeller logbooks for the FAA to be able to inspect. You may have to adhere to maintenance schedules on the aircraft according to FAA regulations. So these are just some of the things that could potentially be required of you as a UAS operator. Well, what can you do to prepare for an unmanned aircraft system? You can become familiar with with aviation as you can. I guess the best thing to do would be to become a pilot, but it's not practical for everybody. But you can take FAA approved ground school curriculums. There's plenty of them out there, and they have exams in them. These are private pilot based exams, and some of the curriculum of the ground school is based on being an actual private pilot. But there's also a ton of information in there regarding air traffic control, airspace, airways, navigation, weather, those sorts of things that all have to do with aircraft and flight systems, regardless of whether it's a manned or unmanned system. Don't do anything illegal. You're going to be behind the 8 ball if you try to operate and think that you're not going to get caught or hope that you don't get caught. It could be potentially a lot of liability for your organization, particularly if you're a private entity. And if something happens and there's an incident of some type, then you have no idea what kind of trouble you're in for. And if not actual fines, just a nightmare of legal proceedings and things like that. So the best thing I can say is just stay the course and be certain that Frontier Precision is going to keep you guys in the loop as soon as things or anytime anything changes regarding UAS. We will let our customers know, and we will be conducting as our systems move forward, the appropriate training and regulation compliance with all of the FAA regulations. These are the sources that I used for this presentation and the article. So if you'd like a list of these sources, let me know. But as you can see, they're all on the FAA's website. You can screen snap this if you want, and then you can go and look up any of these if you have any questions. Again, you can also go refer to the article in this month's Professional Surveyor for some more detailed explanation about some of these. So that is the presentation where we're at with UAS, and I'm going to turn on the question, and I see the DJI Phantom. Is the DJI Phantom considered a UAS? Actually, it's considered a hobbyist plane. And if we go back to the previous slide, as soon as you put a camera on it and use it for commercial applications, it is a UAS. So yes, you can go buy it at a hobby store and you can take it over to the local remote controlled aircraft park and you can fly it all day long and have a great time with it. As soon as you throw a GoPro camera on it and start taking pictures of real estate or job sites or things like that, then no, it's no longer a hobbyist application. So that's, again, the differentiation isn't in the aircraft itself, it's in its use. And so there are people that are trying to mix the two together and say, well, it's a hobbyist aircraft. And if I say that I'm using it as a hobby, your job is not your hobby. Um, Flying remote controlled airplanes might be a hobby. Flying real airplanes may be a hobby. But again, even as a private pilot, if I take a camera on board the plane and I start taking pictures of job sites, I cannot legally utilize that as a commercial operation until I have a commercial rating as an aircraft operator. So the difference is in the use. Are there different rules for universities doing research? This comes from Diana up in Bozeman. And the universities fall under the public agency rule, so they would be subject to obtaining a certificate of authorization from the FAA. Trimble has a COA application guideline that provides you with all the information you need regarding the Trimble UAX5, excuse me. And so universities can get COAs and they can operate for research and testing purposes. University of Colorado, Colorado School of Mines, Colorado State University down here are all in the process of getting COAs to operate various aircraft systems. So yes, it is different for universities. So I'm not sure when some of these questions came in, and maybe your question was answered earlier. Is aerial photography considered collecting geospatial information? If it's used for geospatial purposes, yes, it is. If you're taking, if you're out at the beach taking some aerial images of the beach and your kids playing on the beach or something like that, then no, that's not considered collecting geospatial information. But aerial photogrammetry is collecting geospatial information. How long does it take to apply for and get a COA? The process can be anywhere from probably no less than a couple of months, and usually I think 6 months on the outside. If you've done your homework and you haven't had your application thrown out for some technical reason. That's why Trimble put together the COA guide for the UX5, is to help streamline that process and make it as painless as possible. And if you want to talk to us offline specifically about how to get a COA and what you need, we'll be happy to help you out with that. What if you are contracted with a state, federal, local agency? Are you then legal? No, you are not, because a contractor is not a public entity. Therefore, you cannot get a COA, and you cannot obtain a public aircraft. So it actually has to be the public entity that gets the COA. So if you're contracted by the DOT to do some highway work and you're a private land surveyor, then no, you cannot operate under their COA, and you cannot get one of your own. Where do we see that this is Class B airspace? Oh, you don't. You just know it as a pilot. That's what the colored lines are for, and that's what the pilot education is for. So you know how to read an aeronautical chart. So I guess you'll just have to take my word for it that it's Class B airspace until you can read a aeronautical chart on your own. Can you get a copy of this presentation? I missed the beginning. This will be this recording was done, and it's on our will be on posted on our blog site. Thank you, David. Can I expound on what constitutes Class G airspace? Class G airspace is it's some people call it unregulated airspace, but it's outside of populated areas and away from major airports. And it goes from the surface to as high as 14,000 feet in some places. But generally those are out in kind of nowhere's land. Outside of the magenta polygon that I showed on the Denver airspace map, a lot of that was Class G airspace, and it's places where would be nice for oil and gas companies that would want to maybe do some flights over their oil and gas sites, things like that. Then the question is, can a public-private university legally fly a model hobby aircraft rather than a UAS? A public university is not a business entity, so I would say that yeah, you could legally fly a model hobby aircraft. Well, university applications generally aren't hobbies, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of research on that, and I can talk to the people at the FAA on that and ask them specifically that question, James, and I can get back to you. I have your email address from this presentation. So again, it's really going to kind of depend on what it's being used for, since most university research is not really considered a hobby. So I'm going to probably err on the side of caution and say no. The other thing that I found in working with universities is that most universities have at least as much bureaucracy associated in getting an unmanned aircraft system as the FAA has. So there's liability that the university has to deal with and things like that. Next question, can a public entity contract with a private pilot if he owns the UAS? No, you can't, because the private pilot, it's not a public aircraft. And so the private pilot cannot get the COA, so the private pilot can't operate the UAS. And again, because it's a contract pilot, he's not um, an actual public employee. That scenario won't work. And I actually ran this by the Bureau of Land Management and talked to them about it. And all of their pilots are onboard pilots. They actually work for as far as the UAS is concerned, they are actual employees of the BLM. What if you use a UAS for a private company internal and not for commercial use? You're getting really close to that dangerous point, because it's not for a hobby, then it's for a company. So it cannot be considered, in even internal use would be considered a commercial use. Whether or not you're selling the images or charging for the flight or not charging for the flight and charging for the images, or I don't know, you know, taking a 6-pack of beer for it or something. So the fact that you're a private company basically takes it completely out of the hobby realm, regardless of what you're using it for within your company. So the FAA is supposed to have regulations. They've been mandated by Congress to have regulations in place by September of 2015. So about 15 months from now. We're hoping that they'll have regulations for smaller aircraft before then. Like I mentioned, the maybe things that are for smaller aircraft like the UX-5 in unpopulated areas, but full implementation is going to take much longer than 2015. So we'll see it happen in stages, as my prediction on it, and we'll see, as I mentioned, the smaller planes in uncongested airspaces coming along first, and then bigger aircraft, more populated space much later. Does use of small aircraft like DJI Phantom for aerial photogrammetry by a nonprofit constitute commercial use? Yes, it does. The FAA has already issued kind of a ruling on that. However, they also make exceptions for some nonprofit agencies. So while you can't operate legally, just you can't operate as a public entity, there are some times where you can get a waiver. And I saw this recently, trying to remember the particular scenario, and it had to do with something with wildlife monitoring, I believe. And that's an instance where the FAA looked at where the operation was occurring, what type of aircraft it was, who was doing it, and they issued a waiver. So those are specific instances, Tim, and we can talk to you offline about that. And we have some people that we can direct you to at the FAA that can also help you with that. So that's the last question that I see. If there are no other questions, I'm going to end the recording here. We've been a little bit over an hour, and I'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar. Please email us if you have any additional questions, you think of something that you forgot to ask, and then you can go back and review this recording. We should hopefully have it on our blog site before the end of the week. So again, thank you for attending.